compounds. So you imagine that it's bad areas and secret and fighting each other, sacrifice people there.
Saisambun is the provincial capital of the military zone. No outsiders are allowed here. Government soldiers patrol the area. Nobody wants to talk on camera about the conflict with the remaining Hmong resistance forces. Saisambun is the gateway to Longcheng, which lies a few miles further into the jungle. Vientiane, the capital of Laos, was nowhere near the battlefields, but America's influence on the country's politics became more and more evident.
Laos first does not have an economy. What we did is we subsidized them. And you can see that this can become a license for corruption. And it did.
By 1964, the USA had pumped $545 million of foreign aid into Laos. Never before had America invested so much money abroad in a similar project. And it was all done in the name of democracy.
This sounds familiar. We wrote constitutions for them. We got them to have elections for their National Assembly. We tried to get them to elect their officials. And they went through this process. But they didn't really take to democracy. So you have a real problem. You cannot impose the democracy on the country, as we tried to do in Laos, a constitution and an election. Iraq, a constitution and election.
In 1964, 4 years into the CIA's secret military efforts in Laos, President Lyndon Johnson used fake intelligence to order military attacks against North Vietnam.
Against United States ships on the high seas and the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
We wish to emphasize we seek no wider war.
In 1965, the U.S. introduced combat troops into Vietnam. With the world's attention focused on this expanding conflict, the CIA's war next door in Laos remained low-key. The Vietnam War starts turning the gears of the American war machine in Laos. More than 400 flights a day come into Longcheng. The secret base became the country's second largest city. More and more soldiers arrived with their families in tow, and more CIA case officers and pilots stayed overnight on their missions upcountry. Yet, the entire city remained classified. Longcheng was given the code name Lima Site 20 Alternate, seemingly an auxiliary landing strip to Samton. Outsiders were to assume that the site was reserved for emergency landings. This meant that the CIA, away from the public gaze, had a free hand, and the secret agents in Longcheng could go about their business undisturbed.
It attracted odd people, wonderful odd people. So there was a mystique about it.
The atmosphere surrounding the secret war was bizarre. In Laos, nothing was as it seemed. Secret agents and a private airline were fighting a covert war with a hill tribe army that did not officially exist. Laos's neutrality had become a farce. Men like Air America's country manager Dave Hickler were living it up in Laos. As the war in Vietnam escalated, one major purpose of the operation was now to interrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply network of jungle roads and trails built by the North Vietnamese that led through southern parts of Laos. More and more bombing missions were flown to interdict the trail.
There they are. We're Am I cleared to fire?
Right on. That's both of those.
Hey!
Look at that thing throw pieces off.
What a burner.
That's a large explosion.
Yeah, let's see if we find some more trucks here instead of one fireworks.
Despite sustained attacks, the traffic on the trail never slowed.
As the war in Vietnam developed, Laos became an absolutely critical battleground, particularly that 100-mile stretch between Sam Nua, the Plain of Jars, and Vientiane. That little tiny bit of territory was absolutely strategic, critical if the United States were going to have a chance to win the Vietnam War.
South of the Plain of Jars, the CIA's army in Long Cheng blocked the communists from advancing towards the capital city of Vientiane. The front kept shifting back and forth, and 4 years into the war, no one had made headway. In the meantime, President Johnson entered into peace talks with the North Vietnamese.
The United States had stopped the bombing of North Vietnam in the area where 90% of the people live.
After President Johnson stopped bombing North Vietnam in May 1968, the air war over Laos escalated to new levels. The Americans sent ever more bombers, and the North Vietnamese provided additional support to the Pathet Lao.
In 1970 and 71, there were reports coming back from South Vietnam about U.S. troops starting to use substantial quantities of heroin. And that's what brought me to Laos. I was on the heroin trail.
At that time, more than 30% of American soldiers serving in South Vietnam were addicted to drugs. There were more heroin addicts in the armed forces than in the whole of the United States. In the Golden Triangle of Laos, Burma, and Thailand, the most powerful men had long been opium dealers. These warlords were ideal recruits for the CIA.
Opium was central to the success of the entire CIA covert operation. Why? Because the CIA worked through a single leader, a single broker. All of its connections among people went through Vang Pao. And Vang Pao's control over these scattered households across the ridges and mountains of northern Laos was made possible by the fact that he controlled the air power out of Long Cheng, the rice into the villages and the opium out of the villages.
Alfred McCoy went to a Hmong village aligned to Vang Pao's secret army and learned of a gruesome deal when he talked to the village headman.
The local headman, a man named Gersian, he said, "We did a bargain with the CIA. We gave them our men, and all we asked is for them to feed us. Now, Vang Pao and his men have asked us for the 14-year-olds. If we send the 14-year-olds, who will be the men to marry the daughters of the village and produce the next generation of children? We'll die as a community." So we said no, and they cut off the rice.
But only a few villages could afford to refuse Vang Pao's demands. For the majority of mountain dwellers, there was no way to shield their children from being drafted into the CIA's army. As a result, there weren't enough people left to farm rice. Opium emerged as the only viable source of income.
The Air America helicopters would fly in. Hmong officers, lieutenants and captains in the CIA secret army would get off, pay them cash for the opium, load the opium in the helicopters, and it would fly off in the direction of Long Cheng.
I'm sure it happened. I mean, nobody denies the possibility, but that wasn't what we did. There were certain alliances made in certain areas that within Laos you would move this guy's marijuana from here to there, but that was as far as it went with us, and that was condoned, I would say.
After he'd learned about the secret bombing campaign, Fred Branfman became obsessed with trying to stop it. He started to work with journalists to expose U.S. atrocities committed in Laos.
Probably my sanity was saved by working with these journalists and feeling I was doing something. You know, that every day I could get up I could try to find another journalist, I could interview some of the people, send their photos to the Kennedy subcommittee, and I could do something. And I think that probably was one of the things that saved my sanity at that time.
Mr. Branfman spoke of those refugees whom he has interviewed.
In 1971, Fred Branfman appeared before a U.S. Senate subcommittee on refugees and spoke out against U.S. officials in charge of the secret bombing.
I challenge that statement.
What I'm trying to suggest, sir, is that there is a good deal of evidence to suggest that the United States has been carrying out the most protracted bombing of civilian targets in history.
As far as the media was concerned, Branfman's efforts were mostly ignored. While the world's first televised war was taking place in Vietnam, off-screen, the U.S. Air Force was bombing Laos every 8 minutes. As the veterans returned home, the conflict spilled onto American streets, and the tide of public opinion was turned against the Vietnam War. However, Laos veterans were forced to stay silent, as the executive branch continued to keep Congress in the dark. Whilst in Vietnam, war correspondents went to the front. Reporters who met at the Constellation in the Laotian capital stayed put, and hardly ever challenged the official line of U.S. policy.
I was quite shocked, particularly with two particularly well-known journalists. One is Ted Koppel, who later went on to be the chief correspondent on Nightline, and Bernard Kalb, who at the time was a very important correspondent for CBS. I worked for both of them. I took them both out to the refugee camps. They knew that Henry Kissinger had ordered bombing raids that had murdered thousands of innocent people in violation of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Bernard Kalb wrote a biography of Kissinger. You look in the index, there's nothing about Laos, even though he knew that Kissinger had ordered these horrible bombing raids in Laos. Why? Because they were pursuing their careers.
It wasn't until 1971 that 3 journalists finally made it to Long Cheng and uncovered the secret base. After 9 years of operating in secret, Long Cheng had been exposed. Still, the war in Laos didn't make front-page news.
Even though it became known there was a Long Cheng, the policy continued, and it did not make a big difference, as far as I can tell, on the course of the war or anything else.
The war had gained its own momentum, and in 1971, Long Cheng was attacked by the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces. New CIA case officers, such as Eli Chavez, were assigned to mobilize their remaining mercenary forces. Chavez filmed his own troops as they marched into battle.
I sent them out, and we received a lot of casualties within 5 to 10 minutes. We lost 40 men at that time, killed and wounded. And so there was an anger from the Lao commander, and he said, "You Americans like to fight the war 25 meters away." I was very scared. During the charge, my mom and dad were they taught me an old Spanish hymn, Más allá del sol, and I sung that song all the way when I was charging the hill. During the take-back at Skyline Ridge, we lost 900 people, killed, missing in action, and also wounded in action. And that totaled out to almost 3 battalions that we lost. And that was all within a week and a half to almost 2 weeks' time.
After 11 years of war, all Hmong men of fighting age were dead. And so, The CIA sent thousands of children